In the first scene, we see a young girl wandering alone at night through a forest. Eventually, she finds her friend deep inside the forest with her arm on fire, but she doesn't seem to feel any pain. Believing that she wouldn't feel any pain either, the little girl lets her friend pour oil on her head and holds her friend's hand to catch the fire. But the little girl begins to feel the scorching flames and screams in great pain. At the same time, in some other place, a worried mother is searching for her son. She discovers him in the basement, calmly eating his own arm off. Seeing such a disturbing sight, she cries out in despair, but her son only looks at her in confusion. Half of the story takes place in the year 1931. Children littered with wounds are lined up in front of a room full of people. The doctor conducting this gathering reveals that the children have some neurological condition that makes them unable to feel pain. People are horrified, and the authorities decide that the best course of action would be to keep them confined, as they can be dangerous to themselves and to others. All the children are thrown into a bus and taken to an asylum where the nurses cover their mouths and put them in straitjackets. They are empty and damp with just a single tiny window to provide light. The scene skips to the modern times where we see a middle-aged surgeon named David who wakes up in the hospital after a car crash. His pregnant wife did not survive the accident. However, the doctors were able to save their baby. Adding to his misery, he finds out that he has cancer and needs a bone marrow transplant to save his life. With the pain of losing his wife fresh in his mind, he is not so eager to live, but his coworker manages to convince him to live for the sake of his child. So, accepting the responsibility to raise his child, he goes to the countryside to his elderly parents' house, but their response is rather vague and confusing, as they seem to be hiding something from him. The scene moves back to 1931. Among the children locked in the asylum is a boy named Benigno. He is exceptionally clever, as he manages to break free from his restraints and begins inspecting the room. Soon after, a nurse comes to feed him and discovers that he has broken free, but she doesn't scold him and instead starts to tear up. Seeing such innocent children locked in a place like this makes her heart ache, so she goes to the head doctor to ask how much longer the children will be imprisoned there. The doctor annoyedly replies that since they have no alternative, the children will stay here until a cure is found, which is very unlikely. Hearing this, the nurse decides to write a letter of invitation to Professor Oltzmann on her own, as he is the scientist who had once promised to find a cure for the children. Meanwhile, Benigno has somehow managed to steal a spoon, and with it, he starts digging through the wall in hopes of connecting to the girl locked up in his neighboring cell. It is only 4 years later that he finishes digging, but on the day he finally gets to see the face of the girl in the next cell, Professor Oltzmann arrives in his room to examine him. The head doctor, who has just been notified of his visit, rushes into the room to demand answers. To his annoyance, Oltzmann reveals that he will be staying here in the asylum as long as possible to find a way to cure the children. Days pass while conducting all kinds of experiments on the children, and Oltzmann reaches an unfortunate conclusion that they cannot be cured. However, he proposes a revolutionary idea that has never been considered before, most especially by the children's parents. He believes the children can be taught human behavior so that they might be able to fit in society. One day, in one of his usual classes, he brings in some puppies, which make the children very excited to see them. Among the puppies, one has a kidney tumor, and he asks the children who can remove the kidney without causing pain to the dog, as it has not been given anesthesia. Benigno steps forward to accept the task and successfully removes the kidney with swift and efficient movements, which Oltzmann finds very impressive. Benigno asks if he can have the puppy, but the head doctor sternly refuses and orders him to return to his cell. Despite the refusal, he disobeys and hides the puppy inside his clothes to take it to his cell. That night, hearing the dogs bark, two nurses rush into Benigno's cell. One of the nurses repeatedly slaps him and takes away the dog, which enrages Benigno, prompting him to slash her ankle. Oldsman arrives, asking him to behave rationally. Once he's calmed down, the head doctor gives Benigno one more slap for the road and declares, full of rage, that Benigno is out of the program and will no longer be allowed to leave this cell. Back in the modern times, David is visited by his mother in the hospital. She is there to tell him the truth. He is not her biological son, but a child who his father had picked up from the prison he used to work in to ease the pain of her stillbirth. Through his investigation to find his biological parents, David ends up in the asylum that used to be run by Professor Oldsman and some others in the 1930s. He walks through the abandoned building where he finds a bouquet with a card in front of a door. David visits the address written on the card, which leads him to a man who is an army veteran. He invites David inside, and after listening to his story, the man says that if his mother was in the infamous cell number 17, then she most likely did not survive the torture. The man then reveals that he has a brother who was imprisoned there. He had miraculously managed to escape from that cell and is still alive. Moving back to the year 1936, the Spanish Civil War has broken out, and communist soldiers infiltrate the asylum building to use it as a base. They order all the children to be moved to a single cell, but Professor Oldsman insists on keeping them separated and lies about them having a highly contagious disease. The plan works and the children remain isolated. Sometime later, the Nazis bomb and capture the building, so the communist soldiers take off their uniforms and hide their weapons to blend in among the patients. But their plan is soiled when the Nazis check their bodies for battle wounds and easily distinguish the communist soldiers among the regular civilians. After the soldiers are killed, the Nazis move to target the rest of them. But Oldsman bravely steps forward and manages to convince the Nazis that these special children who cannot feel pain can be used to benefit the Reich. Because of his persuasion, Professor Oldsman, the children, and the nurses are able to leave with their lives, but on the other hand, the head doctor and the others get killed for the crime of sheltering communist soldiers. All of this is seen by Benigno, who is peeping inside the room through a hole in the wall. The scene switches back to David, who returns to see his father. He informs him of the former prisoner whom he will visit tomorrow to find out about his biological parents. Still, his father refuses to talk about the past and tries to convince him that finding out the truth will only make him upset. David becomes furious with his father for preventing him from finding out the truth and stomps out of the house, ignoring his mother's pleas. Back in 1939, the war rages on, and the lack of food and medicine forces Oldsman to euthanize the children. When the scientist enters Benigno's cell for his turn, Benigno pretends to hug him. When Professor Oldsman lowers his guard, he mercilessly stabs him in the back. He then breaks the syringe and uses it to stab him repeatedly. When the nurse notices him approaching with his bloody hands, she quickly closes the door in fear and hands over the key to the Nazis. The door to his cell is opened only a year later when new forces take over the asylum. When they enter the cell, they discover a skeleton hanging in front of the window hole, like some kind of morbid art. They also come across Benigno, who is somehow still alive and somehow still hairless, but now his body is filled with scars and he has stopped talking. The soldiers free him and give him a new name, Burcano. Since then, Benigno starts working for them as a specialized shirtless torturer. The Nazis kidnap and bring enemy soldiers to Benigno's cell, where he interrogates and tortures them to death. Skipping back to David, he has gone to visit the former prisoner to ask about his biological mother, who was imprisoned in that asylum in the 1960s. The former prisoner is frail and on a hospital bed, but he still manages to respond to David's question. He mentions the name of Benigno, who tortured victims during interrogations. He describes Benigno as a vicious being who knows no pain. The man was also tortured repeatedly by him to the point where his body became small enough to fit through a hole, and that was how he escaped. David shows him a picture of his father when he was still a soldier, which results in the man screaming in fright. After learning that his father knew Benigno, David immediately calls him to say that he will be coming to see his father to demand the truth at all costs. Back in the 1960s, a woman is brought to Benigno's cell for interrogation. She is humming a song while they bring her in, and Benigno is ordered to torture her. Yet when he sees her crying, he softens and uses a pocket knife to free the woman and, curiously, gives her the knife. But she doesn't have the courage to kill him. Benigno is amazed by her behavior and keeps her alive without harm, and then, slowly over time, falls in love with her. David arrives at his parents' house where he hears a recording of a woman sobbing and singing while she was being interrogated by the Nazi officers. After the recording ends, he goes upstairs to discover his mother dead and bleeding in the bathtub, while his father is calmly sitting on a chair. His father admits to loving David as if he were his own son, despite him having the same terrible eyes as his real father, Benigno. He then shoots himself right in front of David and ends his life. In the 1960s, David's father had made a deal with Benigno. If he let him take away Benigno's child, then he would leave Benigno and his woman alone and would not harm them. But before leaving, David's foster father had ordered the entrance to the cell to be bricked up so as to prevent Benigno from escaping. The horrifying events that have unfolded one after another leave David disturbed, but now he is too deep into his quest for the truth to stop. He returns to the asylum with a newfound conviction and begins to tear down the wall that has blocked off cell number 17. Inside the room, he finds a hole in the floor that leads to an underground room. He crawls until he reaches a dark and frightening cavern with an intricate structure. He sees a staircase and climbs up, while the sound of a tape recording becomes clearer and clearer. It is the same tape that he had heard at his parents' house. He picks up a lighter next to the tape recorder and discovers that there is a body of a dead woman next to it, which seems to have been preserved. He assumes that it must be his biological mother. As he looks around, a strange old man with scars all over his body approaches him from behind and suddenly attacks him, causing David to drop his lighter. The old man is obviously Benigno, who has somehow remained alive and is still bald, allergic to shirts, and ridiculously ripped throughout all these years. He pulls out a knife, ready to see the tears of fear fall from David's eyes, but David remains unfazed and silent. Benigno stares at him in confusion and then realizes that he has the same blue eyes as his biological mother. The fire from the lighter has started spreading around the room, and Benigno releases David and quietly walks into the flames to lovingly pick up the woman's dead body. The movie ends with a father and son looking into each other's eyes, both of them unstirred by the heat of the flames. And that's a wrap for this movie recap. Thanks for watching.